Welcome. My name is Ravi Prasad. I'm a clinical professor and director of behavioral medicine within the Division of Pain Medicine at ucdavis. I'm going to be speaking with you all today about how we cultivate wellness during challenging times. I'm going to start this presentation with the question that I want all of you to think about, and that is, what is wellness? If you were to type this very question into a search engine online, what you'd quickly find as a results filter through is there's no universal definition. Many different institutions, different sites have different ways that they define wellness, but there's not a universally accepted way in which this is defined. But as you weave through all the different ways that it's listed, what starts to emerge are some common themes across all these definitions. And the definition that I like to use to define wellness is that it's the attention and care that we provide for ourselves across three overarching domains: our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves. Now, these different domains are not mutually exclusive. And what that means is that they're not discrete categories. Rather, they're all intertwined and they can all influence each other. So if something happens to us in our physical domain, that can have impacts in our emotional and spiritual selves as well. But again, these are overarching domains. What makes up our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves? Well, this by itself is multifactorial as well. All of these different variables, all these different factors that are listed on your screen constitute our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves. So nutrition, this goes beyond just our diet, just beyond the food that we put into our bodies, but all the different substances that we consume: alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, supplements, our medications, all of these things can affect our wellness. Our finances, our ability or our inability to make our financial ends meet, ability or inability to anticipate and cover financial expenditures that are unexpected and emergent, our ability or inability to plan for our financial future. Our family and interpersonal relationships. So this involves our parents, our grandparents, our siblings, and the relationships that I have with these individuals. And separate from that, our romantic relationships, our significant others, and all the associations that come with our significant others. So their parents, their siblings, their friends, and those relationships. Our recreational activities. So what are the things that we do to stimulate the pleasure centers in our brain? What are the things that we do to stoke our intellectual curiosity? The things that we do in our leisure time? What are our hobbies? Exercise, the things that we do to maintain our physical wellness, our physical fitness. Being cognizant of our stress levels. In all the different domains in our lives, there's certain boundaries or certain maximums in terms of how much stress that we can tolerate at a reasonable level. So how do we determine what those stress levels are, and how do we set those boundaries? This is part of our efforts at maintaining wellness. But when life throws us curveballs and we get stress levels that exceed those boundaries, that's where this next category of coping strategies comes in. What are the tools that we use to navigate when stress levels get too high for ourselves? And how do we help ourselves return back to baseline? Work activities. We spend the majority of our lives in our workplace setting. And so work is something that can significantly shape our physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And there are multiple domains within work. The work itself, does it provide us with satisfaction? Is it intellectually stimulating? The interpersonal relationships that we have in the work environment, the community in which we live. The community, we can rely on this for support as we encounter difficulties or challenges in our life, but also, do we feel safe and emotionally supported in the community in which we live? Our spiritual activities, and this can be something that's religion-based, or for many individuals, it might not have any religiosity associated with it. But just what do we do to maintain our spiritual wellness? And lastly, cultural factors. Cultural factors can shape the roles and the responsibilities that we have in all of these different domains. Now, this listing that I have up here is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list. So I don't want you to look at this and think, oh, but there are other aspects of my life that I feel fit into my physical, emotional, and spiritual self, but they're not listed here. Not to fret, this is not meant to be exhaustive. There certainly are other areas. I've just listed some of the ones that tend to be more common. And what you'll also notice about these is, like the overarching domains, they're not mutually exclusive. Impacts in one of these categories can have rippling effects in others. So for example, if we have some dysfunction within our family, something stressful happening that challenges our stress levels and taxes our coping strategies, it may have impacts in our work activities, in our recreational activities. It can have a subsequent impact in our finances. So all of these things have the potential to be interrelated. So wellness is a dynamic process. As I mentioned, those different categories were not exhaustive nor mutually exclusive, but trying to create some sort of harmony among all of those different categories, or the categories in our lives that we see that constitute that balance, is what we're trying to achieve for ourselves. It's a dynamic process that never ends. So oftentimes I'll hear individuals talk about, I'm working to achieve wellness. But when I hear that, I imagine that as being a process like working on finishing a puzzle. You know, when you get that last puzzle piece in, you're done. The puzzle's completed. You don't necessarily have to go back unless you want to admire the handiness of your work or the outcome of your work. But wellness isn't quite like that. I like to think of wellness as being more like tending a garden, right? When you have a garden, you have a lot of different plants in your garden. Different plants have different watering needs, different sunlight needs, different feeding needs. And plants bloom at different times of the year, need to be pruned at different times of the year. And they all have, again, their own different needs and needed to be tended to in different ways. Well, it's much the same way that all of these different domains are like different plants in our garden, and they have different needs that need to be tended to in very unique ways. And actually within these categories, there are subcategories that need to be tended to in their own ways. So as we tend our garden, as we constantly work on refining it, it's a place that we go to that we can get great joy and great peace out of. And it's constantly a work in progress, again, that's dynamic in nature. And the beauty of this is it's very individualized. How you want your garden to look is up to you. What you want your wellness to look like is up to you. But it's important for you to determine what constitutes your own wellness. That's not somebody else's decision to make for you. But also, one of the things I like about this parallel is that even a garden that's not perfect can still be enjoyable, right? And that's the thing about wellness. We're not striving for perfection. I would actually say there is no such thing as perfection because the work is never done. The goal is to continue to work toward this. Now, I appreciate that with these types of presentations, there's always somebody who might be a naysayer who might say, well, I don't like that. I don't like this wellness and I hate gardening, so that doesn't work for me. Well, you can take any parallel in life that you want, right? Think about an athlete, right? If an athlete works really hard to get onto an elite team and they finally make the cut and they're on this elite team, does that mean now that they're done and they don't have to keep on working and being at the top of their game? No. If anything, they need to continue and they maintain that. But this becomes part of what gives them quality of life. And that's what we really want wellness to be, is something that's a part of our life, something that's individualized, that does give us meaning. Unfortunately, being able to create that harmony within ourselves is challenging in today's world. There's a lot of different threats to finding that harmony and working toward having that wellness in our day-to-day lives. I'm going to focus on the 5 threats that I commonly hear my patients talk about in terms of what interferes with their ability to find that wellness or that harmony. And these 5 areas are threats in the family realm, work, climate change, politics, and social media. So we'll start by talking about family. So there's a lot of changes that have occurred with family and family lives over the course of time. For one, there's been a lot of different advances in medical technology, medical science, where now life expectancy has increased for individuals. Many diseases, many conditions that used to be death sentences or that resulted in people dying prematurely are no longer problematic for us. And we have cures, treatments that allow people to continue to live very good, productive lives, even with some of these different conditions. So people are living longer. But that's created its own set of challenges. While there can be a great thing with that we get to have our loved ones with us longer, many of the individuals who are living longer didn't expect that they may live that long. And so there can be financial challenges associated with that. There can be housing challenges associated with that. There can be emotional distress associated with that as other members of their social groups pass away and they get a sense of isolation. We've seen a shift, especially in recent years, to multi-generational living. And this is where multiple generations are living under the same roof at one time. And like extended life expectancy, this is something that has some good things, but also some challenging things. Many individuals cherish and love the opportunity to be able to have all of their family around them. But this can also bring stress, particularly if there's a lot of individuals living in a small space. There can be stress related to disagreements related to how to raise children, different ways of living, the way the living space should be. Elderly parents may feel upset that they're having to live with their children, that that's not something that they had planned on doing, or children may be upset that they're having to provide care for their elderly parents, which was something that they weren't planning on doing. Again, these aren't always stressors that people experience, but for some individuals, this creates a higher level of tension. The role of grandparents. Also in recent years, we've seen increasing presence of grandparents in their grandchildren's lives. And a primary caregiver role for their grandchildren, in other cases taking on a significant role in helping to raise them, childcare type of responsibilities. And again, like all the things we've talked about so far, there can be good things, but also challenges with that. The grandchildren may love being able to spend time with their grandparents, but this may not have been what the grandparents had envisioned for themselves. And so that can also create some additional stress. And then finally, the divorce rate. In the US, our divorce rate is over 40%. And so we can appreciate that with that, there's a high level of conflict that's occurring in many homes. Now, this divorce rate has actually decreased over the last 25 years, but 40% is still a pretty significant number. So we can see that with these different bullet points that I have here, there can be a lot of good with some of these, but these can also be very ripe sources of stress. And when that stress comes about, it can create emotional distress in the form of things like anxiety, depression. It can disrupt the harmony that we have in those different domains of our life. And as those disruptions come about, it can affect our work. It can affect our leisure activities. It can affect our involvement and our engagement with family itself. But this is just one of the areas where we see threats. We also see threats occurring in the work environment. As I mentioned before, work is a place where we typically spend the majority of our time in our lives. And with work, one of the areas where we can start to see a lot of discontent occur is in the realm of the responsibilities that people have to take on within their jobs. In recent years, there's been a dearth of individuals for many jobs. So there's been a lot of companies that, quite frankly, aren't able to find enough people to hire for the roles that they have. So individuals are taking on additional responsibilities that weren't originally a part of their job. And so this can result in a higher level of stress because people may not be getting additional compensation, but now they have additional responsibilities. Or they're being asked to do things that they feel is out of their purview, things that they weren't trained to do. Beyond that, there may be other changes that occur related to work responsibilities. As we age, as we become more mature, the things that we envisioned for ourselves when we were young and first got into a job, they may change over the course of time. Meaning the person that we were when we started the job, the goals and vision that we had, they may change, but we may still be in the same job. And so basically there may be a disconnect between the job we have and the person that we are. And that can create a significant amount of stress for an individual. There can be interpersonal issues that emerge in the work environment. There can be hostile work environments where there's conflict with coworkers, conflict with supervisors, inappropriate behavior in the work environment. And this can create a significant amount of stress. People can also feel a sense of immobility within their work. And immobility can take on multiple formats. A person might feel that they're stuck geographically, where they have to live in a certain region due to family commitments. A person may feel that they're not going to be able to get the same salary that they have in a different job due to seniority that they have. And so they're stuck in a job where they're not getting personal fulfillment. A person may feel that they've maxed out at their particular job and there's no more advancement they can get because they're at the highest level that they can achieve within their specific role. But all of these things start to contribute to a sense of burnout. Right? And then when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of individuals transitioned to working remotely. Over the course of time, that's changed, where some people have gone back to working in the office, some people have continued to work remotely. And that remote work is like many of the things we've talked about so far today. There's some things about that can be a blessing, but there's some things about that can be a curse. For some individuals, it may be great that they don't have to commute anymore. They can spend more time with family. But for other individuals, it can be a stressor because they don't have their commute, which was part of what gave them their space between work and family. And they're constantly around family where they're stressed because they're never getting a break. And so this can create a significant amount of stress for individuals as well. So all of these different issues, stressors in these different domains, are associated with, similar to the family stresses, different emotional distress, depression, anxiety, anger, irritability. Individuals can start to develop physical health issues as these emotional distress levels start to rise. And this is important because not only does it upset a person's own emotional, physical well-being and wellness, but it can also be associated with healthcare costs. As a person starts to have physical, emotional health issues, they may pull away from work. They may go on disability, which has a societal cost as well. Climate change. This is something that's been emerging as well in recent years, and something that many may be surprised to see because we don't necessarily think about this. But this is something that actually, certainly in our clinical practice, I've seen a lot of individuals raise concern about. Weather is something that's been a significant issue over the course of time. The changes in weather in all the different parts of the country, we see changes in weather patterns, hurricanes that come with greater intensity. In Northern California, we see higher incidence of wildfires. And all of these things have a trickle-down effect. With hurricanes and with wildfires, it's difficult for many people to get insurance on their homes. And if they're not able to get insurance, if they have a loan on their home, the lender won't continue to let them borrow. And so they're no longer able to keep their home. Or people aren't able to buy homes in areas because they can't get insurance. Or the cost of the insurance is so high that they're not able to afford it, and so they're not able to have housing. So individuals who have, solid backgrounds, who are working individuals, aren't able to have steady housing because of the incremental effects from climate change, or the ripple effects from climate change. The U.S. Global Change Research Program has identified multiple implications from climate change, multiple threats to our safety and health. There are threats to our water, food, and air quality, and there are also threats to physical and mental health. But unfortunately, these threats that we see in these different areas aren't universal. They don't impact all of us equally, but we see that there are disparities across different socioeconomic levels in terms of how they impact people, with unfortunately those that are less fortunate get hit a bit harder. Politics. This almost goes without saying. We all know for so many years, for decades, centuries, that politics is just one of those things that you just don't talk about if you don't want to have conflict. But unfortunately, this is something that, especially in recent years, has garnered a lot of attention. And it's not that the issue of politics has changed. It's always been this way. As I mentioned before, it's always been something that's created a lot of divisive discussion. But what has changed over the course of time is the nature of the discussions people have, the mechanism for how the discussions are held, and also the impacts that these have on other folks, in the sense that over the course of time, people have become much, much more polarized. And that can become a bit more challenging, and that creates a lot of distress within many of the realms that we've talked about so far. When political conversations start to emerge with family, when they start to emerge in the work environment, it can start to tarnish the relationships that we have in those different domains. And political viewpoints are things that are very challenging to challenge. They're not things that are very movable. And so it's one of those things that we're stuck with, in a sense. So how do we navigate that when there's something that we're not able to shift in another individual, but it affects us on a daily basis? Well, we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. And one of the mechanisms for how politics has become so pervasive in our society is our next and final category, which is social media. Like everything that I've talked about so far with the threats, social media is not an all bad thing. There have actually been some very good things about social media, but given that I'm focusing more on the threats that these different domains play, I'm going to focus more on those aspects in this discussion here. So one of the challenges with social media is it fuels this sense of keeping up with the Joneses, right? We always need to make sure that we one up somebody else, or that we're doing the same as the neighbors or our friends from high school. There's the concept of FOMO, fear of missing out. We want to make sure that we're not missing out on anything. But the thing that we don't recognize when we're looking at the different posts that we see is it's just very one-sided. You know, when somebody posts a 30-second video or a 60-second clip, we're not seeing what's going on for the other 23 hours and 50 some odd minutes of that person's day. But that's not necessarily what we think about, right? We're only fixated on that happy-go-lucky person who looks like they have such a wonderful life. Bullying is something that we see quite extensively in social media. And when you see that word bullying and you hear about that, you may automatically just start thinking about kids and adolescents. And certainly that's where a lot of the scientific study has been done. But bullying doesn't only affect children. There's bullying for adults as well. And this is where we see some of the impact of the politics and some of the other stresses that we see with social media, where these things interact with each other. Another thing that we see with social media is experts. I don't think that I've ever heard of so many experts in my entire professional career, but now everybody is an expert. And so this creates its own set of difficulties. How do we know what to believe? What do we know is true? Is what I'm saying true? Am I an expert? You know, we don't know what's valid or what's not valid. And so that can create a lot of stress within our own systems. And as I mentioned before, I don't want to make it sound like I'm just disparaging all this, because social media has had some positive impact. So keep in mind that I'm only focusing on some of the more detrimental aspects. So all of these different threats have led to a sense of perceived inescapability, right? As we look at some of the different family stressors that come up, as we look at the stresses that pop up in work, things related to politics, things related to social media, the common thread with a lot of these is these are situations that I can't control. I can't control other people and what they say, what they do, what they think. So I'm helpless, I'm hopeless, I'm vulnerable, and I just have to suffer. And certainly, if that's what you're experiencing, if that's what your perception is, then your physical, your emotional, your spiritual well-being certainly will be compromised, right? But I want to highlight that top word on this slide, perceived inescapability. The reality is while we may not be able to control all of the circumstances around us, and we cannot control other people or what they say or do, the thing that we do have the power to influence is how they impact us. And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the next section of this presentation, is how do we influence the impact that these threats have on our well-being, and how can we rise above that? And so this concept of rising above these things and not allowing them to break up that harmony that we're trying to work toward accomplishing within ourselves is the whole concept behind cultivating wellness within ourselves. I mentioned that wellness is basically trying to find that harmony. It's always a work in progress. But the way that we do that isn't by just saying, I'm going to set this boundary and this is going to be where it sticks, I'm done. As I said before, it's constantly a work in progress. We have to utilize coping strategies to try to help us adhere to those different boundaries that we set for ourselves. But what are those coping strategies? We don't get taught those things when we're in school, when we're in college. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about what these tools might look like. During our talk, I'm only going to focus on 3 coping strategies. But like everything I've mentioned so far today, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are a wide range of different coping strategies that you can use to help cultivate your wellness. And it's important for you to figure out which tools fit you the best, which ones work best for you. I'm going to talk about the ones that fit best for me. And so I've chosen the ones that are personal to myself, but I've also chosen the ones that have the strongest scientific evidence behind them. And I'm going to spend less time talking about the science behind them and a little bit more time talking about how do we do these things? What do these things look like? Now, one of the downsides of when I talk about psychological tools is a lot of times people may start to tune out and think, okay, well, this is just psychology. It's not really rooted in any kind of science. It's just the soft stuff that people can do to make themselves feel better. But the reality is all the things that I'm going to mention today are grounded in science and have extensive scientific literature supporting their use. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is relaxation training. So you may be thinking, wait a second, you just said that everything you talk about is scientifically based. This first thing you're talking about sounds very soft. That doesn't sound scientifically based at all, but it actually is. So all of us are pretty much wired the same. Our brains are always on, and our brains are always processing information around us. One of the things that the brain is responsible for is detecting the presence of threats or stresses in the environment. Whenever the brain detects the presence of a threat or a stress, it activates a part of the body's nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system. And you can see that on the very bottom of your screen there. The sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system, which is an automatic part of the nervous system. We usually don't do anything to control this. It's just regulated on its own by the brain. So whenever the brain detects the presence of a threat or a stress, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. When the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, there's a whole host of changes that happen in the body. Your heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, blood vessels constrict, muscle tension increases, a stress hormone called cortisol gets released in the body, pupils dilate, your breathing patterns change, and there's a whole series of additional systemic changes that occur in your body. As soon as the brain detects that a stress or a threat is no longer present, it activates another part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which brings the body right back down to its previous baseline. Heart rate slows down, blood pressure decreases, muscle tension is released, blood vessels expand, cortisol stops being released in the body. Your body goes back to its baseline. Now, you all have felt this before. Think about if you're driving your car, somebody cuts you off in traffic. All of a sudden, you tighten your grip on the wheel, you sit up straight, you hold your breath, you feel your heart beating 1,000,000 miles a minute. That's your sympathetic nervous system activating in the face of stress. But eventually, as you realize you're a safe distance from that car in front of you, eventually the body calms down, which is a parasympathetic returning you to normal. You didn't do anything to create those changes in your body, meaning you didn't tell yourself, let me speed up my heart, let me tighten my muscles. All of this was regulated by your brain as it detected the presence or absence of a threat. Now, you might remember this from high school biology as being called the fight or flight response in the body. And it's there in all of us. We're all wired this way. But the thing is when we learn about this fight or flight response, it's always taught to us in terms of a life-threatening stressor causing these changes. But the reality is that the threshold that the brain uses to trigger this sympathetic nervous system activation is much lower than that. The threshold that the brain uses is simply, is this stressful or not? And anytime the brain identifies something as being stressful, it triggers some sympathetic nervous system activation, right? So why is this relevant? Well, this is relevant because anything that gets interpreted as stress can cause some of that activation. So if we think back to those threats that I talked about, right? Conflict with family members, tension in the work environment, charged political conversations, looking at Facebook posts that are overwhelming for us emotionally, right? Any of these things, they're not life-threatening by any means, but they can all cause emotional distress. And that emotional distress, again, while not life-threatening, it's perceived by the brain as something stressful. And so it's going to cause some degree of sympathetic activation. And this is important for our physical health because if we have chronic stress, chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system, it has implications for our cardiovascular functioning. If we have a pain condition and we have this chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the changes in the muscle tension can worsen the physical pain that we have. So this chronic stress arousal has impacts on our physical well-being. So one of the things that you can do to minimize this threat to your physical well-being and your emotional well-being is to practice relaxation training, or breathing exercises. And there's different ways that people teach breathing exercises, but I have 3 steps that I usually teach patients when they do breathing exercises. The first step is that you want your breath to be a deep diaphragmatic breath. Diaphragm, we have a dome-shaped muscle underneath our lungs that is a barrier underneath our thorax. And when we breathe in, when we inhale, when we exhale, that causes the expansion and contraction of the diaphragm. That muscle moves. And so we cause that movement as we're breathing in deeply. And so this is why we call it diaphragmatic breathing, because we're breathing fully into the lungs, causing the lungs to expand completely, and that diaphragm to expand and contract. So that's the first step, is we want the breath to be nice and deep. The second thing is we need the breathing to be slow and rhythmic. I mentioned before that when we have that sympathetic nervous system activation, our breathing tends to change. What usually happens is we either hold our breath or we start to do very shallow, short breathing. So we're trying to reverse this process and do slower, deeper breathing. I usually teach patients to count to a certain number of seconds on the inhale, pause for a certain number of time, and then exhale for a certain number of seconds before they start that cycle of respiration again. And this cycle should feel very wave-like. It shouldn't feel like I inhaled, I stop, pause, exhale for a certain time, pause, take another breath. It shouldn't feel jagged like that, but rather very wave-like. And the final step with the breathing exercises, and this is the most critical step, is we need to pay attention to where our mind goes. We need to have control over our thoughts. If we're trying to do deep diaphragmatic breathing to quiet some of the body's nervous system reactivity, but we keep thinking about stressful thoughts, we keep thinking about the hurtful thing that somebody said to us, then the body is just going to get hyper-aroused again. So let me expand on that for you. What happens when we do the breathing exercises, the reason why it works is we're triggering parasympathetic activity of the body's nervous system. As we start to regulate our breath, we're starting to influence this autonomic process within the body's nervous system. So the brain sees, oh, there's not a stress present. We don't need to have this hyperarousal of the nervous system. And so it's almost like a relay race where you take a baton, you hand it over to the brain, and it starts to trigger parasympathetic activity. So heart rate starts to go down, blood pressure goes down, and all of this gets triggered by regulation of the breathing, right? And so as you do this with that deep, slow, rhythmic breathing, that's starting to quiet the body down. But then if all of a sudden you start thinking about those stressful thoughts, those thoughts are a stress by themselves. So it's going to reactivate the body's nervous system. And so you'll walk away from that situation saying, oh, breathing doesn't help. And it's not that the exercise didn't help, it's that it wasn't optimized because the thoughts became intrusive and undermined the benefit that you were getting. So we really need to be able to control those thoughts, which is a lot easier said than done. Think about the last time you were upset about something. How easy was it to shift your awareness away from that? That's not what we do. We tend to perseverate or fixate on whatever it is that's upsetting us. So even though I can list this on a slide very simply, these steps are actually very hard to do. But once we master them, it does trigger this parasympathetic activity, which has a strong implication for our cardiovascular health. As I mentioned before, if we have physical pain issues, it can have a positive impact on our pain as well. And to a lesser extent, one of the benefits that we get from relaxation training, and the reason it can be beneficial, is this simple element of distraction. I usually don't focus on this as much. I focus more on the physiologic benefits, but there is that secondary benefit of distraction. Our brains have a finite amount of awareness. We can't be aware of everything that's going on all the time because we just have a limited capacity. And so if we're trying to focus our mind on our breathing, trying to focus our mind on thoughts that aren't stressful, we don't have bandwidth to focus on whatever that issue was that was causing us to stress to wind up the nervous system in the first place. So for that period of time that you're doing the exercises, you're giving your body an emotional and physical reprieve from those stressors. It's not long lasting, but it's at least a reprieve that you get for that period of time, and it allows the body to physically reset itself. So that's some of the physiologic changes that we accomplished with successful relaxation training. I'm going to now move on and talk about cognitive processes, or the role of our thoughts. Cognition refers to our thoughts. So as human beings, we act as if we're stimulus response creatures. Something happens, and based on that situation, we have our emotional, physical, and behavioral consequences. So for example, if my wife and I went out to dinner one night, and if I said to the host that seats us for dinner, "I like the tie that you're wearing tonight," right? If he hears me make that compliment to him, and if he thinks to himself, "Well, I'm really glad that he said that. I chose this tie because I thought it looked nice with my shirt and jacket, and so I really appreciate that somebody noticed that," right? If that's how he's thinking about the situation, emotionally, he'll probably feel happy. Behaviorally, he might smile. And physiologically, thinking back to the last set of slides we had, he's probably not going to have much in the way of nervous system reactivity. There's no threat, there's no stress, so his body will continue to stay in its baseline state. Let's say he goes on a break right after he seats us at our table, and a coworker sees him with a grin from ear to ear. And they say, "Why are you smiling? Why are you in a good mood?" He'll say, "Oh, it's because of the comment that guest made about my tie." Right? Same situation. I tell the host, "I like the tie that you're wearing." If he thinks to himself, why is that guy making a comment about my tie? When I came in this morning, my manager looked at me and she said something too about my tie. And the last time I wore this tie, I remember my neighbor looked at me in a funny way. Why is everybody always fixated on what I'm wearing and what I'm doing? Why don't people just mind their own business? I'm so tired of everybody focused on me. If that's how he's interpreting the situation, consequently, emotionally, he might feel anxious and angry. Behaviorally, he might be more irritable. He might have a scowl on his face. And physiologically, because he does feel stressed because of those emotions and that appraisal he's making, he may have more sympathetic nervous system activation. If he's got a cardiovascular condition, that's not going to be good for that. If he's got a pain condition, it's going to irritate that. Now, let's say he goes on a break right after he seats us, and a coworker sees him kind of storming into the break room with a scowl on his face and says, "What's wrong? Why are you upset?" He's going to say, "It's because a guest made a comment about my tie." So let me ask you this. The exact same situation, but very different consequences. Is it really the situation that caused those consequences? Well, the reality is no. It's not the situation, but rather it's how that individual interpreted that situation. And this is the crux of the cognitive behavioral model. It says it's not the situation that determines how we feel emotionally, how we behave, or what happens for us physiologically, but it's how we interpret a situation that leads to those emotions, behaviors, and physiologic reactions. So I want to be clear. This doesn't mean that we can will away things that we don't like, or we can somehow change situations that are not to our liking. We don't have the power to change something that's already happened, but the impact that these things have on our overall well-being, we do have the power to influence. And again, that's the crux of this model, which I find to be very empowering. But what makes this challenging? Why is it that if somebody asks the host, he just jumps to the situation? Part of the reason why is because our interpretations, our thought processes, tend to be very automatic. We don't stop and think about how we're going to think about things. Most of our thoughts occur in our subconscious, and we're not actively aware of them, right? And that may sound scary to you, but the reality is that's actually adaptive, because if we had to stop and think about every single thing, life would move way too slow. We couldn't possibly move at the pace with which we move right now. So it's an adaptive thing to have these different automatic thoughts. But when those thoughts lead to maladaptive outcomes, that's where they can start to be problematic. But where do these thoughts come from? Where does this programming within ourselves evolve from? Well, they're rooted in our perception of ourselves, and they start from our earliest life experiences. The messages that we get from teachers, other kids, parents, our siblings, all of these shape how we view ourselves, how we view the world around us, and how we view our role in the world around us. And this is partly why children believe in things like Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny, right? Because they're told by people that they respect that these things exist and these things are real. Those are relatively benign things. But what if a child is told something like, "You're stupid, you're not good enough, you can't do anything right," right? These are messages that the child internalizes, and that becomes part of the way that they view themselves or the way that they view the world around them. And even if as that child becomes an adult, they're able to look back and understand that, oh, well, I was bullied in school and I was told those messages by a kid who had their own issues. Or, mom and dad said that to me, but they had their own challenges because of their upbringing. Even if they're able to reconcile the source of that messaging, that doesn't mean that they've changed the lenses through which they view the world around them and how they continue to process the information that comes to them. And so as a result of that, these thought processes tend to be extremely ingrained. And because of that automaticity and because they're so ingrained, it can take a while to change these thought processes. And just being aware of them isn't enough. And so like any of the other things that I talk about today in terms of these tools that we have, they're easier said than done. The concepts are easy to grasp and easy to understand, but the process of implementing them can be a bit more work. So we'll go through a real life example using those threats, but before I do that, I want to take a step back and kind of go over what the overarching goals of cognitive behavioral interventions are. So basically what we want to do is we want to target maladaptive thought processes to try and achieve healthier outcomes in our emotional, behavioral, and physiologic outcomes, right? So let's see what this might look like as we look at some of those threats. So let's say that you look at a Facebook post that somebody makes and they make a comment, about you that you perceive as being disparaging, right? Something that hurts your feelings, that ties in family-related issues, politics, and something about your life, right? And you see this get very hurt, right? The hurt is probably something that you're aware of immediately, but we need to take a step back and look at what are the thought processes that are driving this. Well, it might be, I'm not liked. I've accomplished nothing. You might think, I can't take this, right? Well, if those are the thoughts that we have, then naturally you might feel sad, might feel anxious, might be angry. From a behavioral perspective, we might be more irritable, might snap at other people, and our productivity in the different domains of our life will probably be compromised. We're not going to be as productive at work, might not be as engaged with our family, with our friends. And because of all of the emotional reactivity that we have, because of the stressful thoughts, because of the lack of productivity, nervous system is going to be more activated. And that's going to have implications for our physical well-being as well, right? And if somebody asks us what's going on, we're going to naturally attribute it to the Facebook post. But the reality is what's driving this are the thought processes that we have about that post. Yes, the post may have started it and been the first domino to fall, but we can still influence some of our outcomes by making a change in the thought processes. So why do we focus on the thoughts? Well, we can't go back and change the post. That's already there. It's hard to try to change emotions. If you're having these thoughts in the back of your mind and somebody tells you, just stop being sad, stop being angry, that's not really an effective approach, right? We can try to make behavioral changes, but again, if these are the thoughts that are in the back of our mind, I'm not liked, I've accomplished nothing, it's going to be hard for those changes to really stick. And so this is why we target the thoughts. But the first thing that we need to do is become aware of the thoughts. That part is challenging by itself because what we usually feel is what's going on for us physically and emotionally. So just being aware of the cognitions is something challenging. Number two, as you start to become aware of the thoughts, there are more than just 3 thoughts that we typically have in a stressful situation. I've only listed 3 because I wanted to make sure that it's in a large enough font that you can read the slide. But the reality is that we have 20, 30, 40, 50 different thoughts about any single situation, more than that. And so we actively need to write down all of those thoughts and do the same exercise that I'm about to do with you here. So you've identified the thoughts. What we do when we're doing cognitive behavioral work is we need to ask ourselves 2 questions about the thoughts. Is this helpful and is this accurate? Many times people think that what we do in cognitive behavioral work is you just need to think positively. You just need to turn something negative into something positive. But it's not that simple. Life isn't that simple. And many times there are difficult things that happen in life that you can't just put a positive spin on. And so that's not what we do in CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, but rather we know it's when our thoughts lose their helpfulness and when they lose their accuracy, that's when we start to move down a more maladaptive pathway. So we assess the thoughts on these 2 levels. Is this helpful and is this accurate? And if we can't answer yes to both of those questions, we modify the thought into a statement that is accurate and helpful. So these three thoughts, I'm not liked, everyone's doing better than me, I can't take this, are they helpful? Are they accurate? No. The answer is no to both those questions for all three of these thoughts. So we need to modify it. So how would we modify it? One person doesn't represent everybody I know. I may feel this way now, but I have a lot to be grateful for. And I've worked through hurtful situations before and came out okay. You'll notice with the modified thoughts, this isn't just putting a positive spin on what's going on, but it's relating to the emotional content of that original thought, but just making it more accurate and helpful, right? And the goal is to eventually have that be the new automatic thoughts you have. That's not going to happen in the heat of the moment, right? It's going to take a bit of work to get to the point where you're able to shift your thinking so that when those posts come up, that's the kind of thoughts that you have. But that's what the overarching goal is. And when you do see that Facebook post, and instead you think a single person isn't representative of who I am, I have a lot to be grateful for, and I've gone through difficult times before, and I've made it through okay. That doesn't mean you're not going to feel sad, not have anxiety, not have anger. You'll still have those emotions because you're human, but the intensity is going to be less. When you participate in other skills to try to quiet that nervous system reactivity, such as breathing exercises, the likelihood that they're successful will be stronger, which means that your ability to be productive in your other domains will be higher. And you're breaking that nervous system reactivity. So the overall physical and emotional impact that this stress has is minimized. You can't change that this is still something stressful in your life. And again, that's not what the goal is. We can't control other people, but we have been able to minimize its impact on us. And these cognitive behavioral interventions have extensive amount of scientific study that's been done where we know that they can be extremely effective for treating depression, anxiety, pain, and addictions. And so finally, I'll summarize the cognitive behavioral work with the last slide that talks about the changes that happen in our brain when we actually use cognitive behavioral interventions. So this slide actually depicts structural changes and functional changes in the brain after people have done cognitive behavioral interventions specifically for pain. So this is more than just, okay, I'm changing something about my thinking, but it actually just changed the neural networks within our brain as we start to implement these things. So this brings us to our final category of mindfulness. So Jon Kabat-Zinn is the individual who's credited with bringing a lot of mindfulness philosophies into Western medicine. And he defines mindfulness as the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment to moment. Now, I want to emphasize that last piece of moment to moment because in a nutshell, that's what mindfulness-based interventions do, is they focus on allowing us to stay in the present moment. Many times in our lives, our minds are filled with tons of different things where we're not in the present moment. We're thinking about a million different things at any given time. And so we're not fully appreciating what it is that we have around ourselves in that particular moment. Now, the reason why this can have implications in a stressful situation or in terms of maintaining our wellness is when stressful things come up, when we have those threats that pop up, they can become all-consuming. And they become the primary thing that we focus on instead of any of the other things that are going on in our lives in that moment. We can use mindfulness-based interventions to help us learn how to cultivate the ability to have these threats exist in our life, in our environment, without them overwhelming and overpowering us. That's not the only way that mindfulness can be helpful, but that's one of the ways that we can use mindfulness to help us navigate stressful situations. So in mindfulness, we're not seeking to modify our responses or modify our thoughts like we do in cognitive behavioral interventions, but rather learning how to be present without attaching to the thoughts or attaching to the emotions that come with them. We're just here, but not fixating on the sadness that we feel or the anxiety, but just noticing it's there. And what we do with mindfulness is we integrate breathing with our other senses to create a meditative experience. Many times people hear meditation or they hear mindfulness and they think, oh, it's a religious thing. And it can be if that's what you want it to be, but at its core, it's not. The meditative experience comes from the focus that we have internally. So an example or an exercise that's often done when people are learning mindfulness is eating a raisin. Oftentimes when we eat raisins, we just, throw them in our mouth, chew them, swallow them, and we're done with it, right? But an example of how we might eat a raisin mindfully is to take the raisin, spend some time looking at it, looking at the different textures, and then seeing how it feels, putting it in our mouth. How does it taste when it goes in your mouth? What are the textures that you're aware of? What happens in your mouth in terms of your saliva as it rolls around in your mouth? Start chewing it. Does the raisin's consistency change as you chew it? And then as you swallow the raisin, what happens? What happens to the saliva in your mouth? What are the sensations that you feel in your throat? When the raisin's gone, what are the sensations in your empty mouth? Now, you might listen to this and think, wow, that sounds really interesting, and interesting in a weird way. That, why would I do that with the raisin, and what's this got to do with my wellness? But what we're actually doing is we're trying to learn how to focus. As you're focusing on these different sensations, you're learning to train your brain from quieting that overactive mind that would otherwise be thinking about, oh, I need to pick Johnny up from soccer later on. Oh, these are the things I need to get from the grocery store. Oh, I need to make sure I call an electrician to take care of that faulty light that we have outside. The busy brain that's constantly going. The stressors that will hang around in the back of our brain that stop us from sleeping at night. All of these things create sympathetic nervous system activation, which has implications for our cardiovascular functioning. They have implications for our pain, if we have a pain condition, functioning. And learning how to quiet a lot of that overreactivity is one of the things that mindfulness allows us to do. So when we consistently apply mindfulness strategies in our life, it can lower the baseline hyperarousal of our nervous system. We're always exposed to stress, but where we sit at our baseline can be lowered when we consistently apply mindfulness. Also, it can help ground us more quickly when we're in the midst of a stressful situation. When we're dealing with a high crisis situation, we can implement those mindfulness skills to help bring us back into a calmer state. And studies have shown that application of mindfulness can help reduce depression and improve quality of life. And this was noted specifically within pain populations. So as we wrap up this presentation, as we wrap up this time together, I'm going to ask a question that I asked at the very beginning. What is wellness? Well, wellness is something that's very individual specific. And so as you cultivate your wellness, I want you to think, what are the factors that shape your physical, spiritual, and emotional wellness? We know those are the overarching domains, but what are the factors that shape that for you, right? Think about that matrix of different factors that I had. What are those factors that apply for you? What are other factors that aren't on that matrix that apply for you? What factors positively influence your wellness and which ones negatively impact it? And how might you use some of the tools that we presented today, although briefly, to help maximize the positive factors and minimize those negative factors? Stressful situations are going to continue to occur. Even if you use these things we talked about, they're not going to cure you of these stressors. They're not going to eliminate them. That's not the goal. But it is something that can help improve your baseline. It can help you recover from stressful situations quicker. And the potential impact on your physical and emotional well-being can be reduced. So all of this is meant to just be a starting point, just to get you to start thinking about what you might be able to do to cultivate your own wellness. And remember, this is always a work in progress. Growth is something that never stops. Just like a garden, it's something that we can continuously work on until it's the way that we want it to be. But even then, the work is never done. So thank you very much for taking the time to log on.